It is 1:30 in the morning on July 17th, 1918. In a cramped basement room of the Ipatiev house in Yekaterinburg, Russia, Tsar Nicholas II stands facing a wall of armed men. He is wearing his soldier's shirt. His wife Alexandra sits in a chair behind him. Their 5 children stand clustered together, 4 daughters and 1 son. The girls wear white blouses. The youngest child, 13-year-old Alexei, sits in another chair because his legs cannot support him. The man in charge reads from a piece of paper. He declares that the Ural Soviet has decided to execute them. Nicholas turns and says only 2 words. What? What? A revolver rises. The first bullet strikes him in the chest. He falls. Alexandra tries to make the sign of the cross, but dies before her hand reaches her forehead. The room explodes with gunfire. Smoke fills the basement. The children scream. For 20 minutes, the executioners shoot, stab, and bludgeon 7 members of the imperial family. The 4 Grand Duchesses refuse to die. Bullets bounce off their bodies. The girls have sewn 18 pounds of diamonds and jewels into their corsets, and the gems now act as body armor. The killers resort to bayonets. By the time silence returns to that basement, 304 years of Romanov rule have ended in blood and smoke. But the immediate family was not the only bloodline. Outside that basement, dozens of Romanovs remained alive. Nicholas had a mother. He had sisters. He had cousins and aunts and uncles scattered across the crumbling Russian Empire. Within hours of those gunshots, every surviving member of the dynasty became a target. Some would be thrown down mine shafts. Others would face firing squads in prison yards. A few would escape on warships sent by their royal cousins in Britain. And for the next century, impostors would emerge from asylums and slums, claiming to be the children who died in that basement. This is what happened to the Romanov family after Tsar Nicholas II was executed, and why their story reveals what happens when the blood of kings becomes the blood of fugitives. The Romanov dynasty had ruled Russia for over 3 centuries. In 1613, a National Assembly chose a 16-year-old Michael Romanov to be Tsar, ending years of chaos and civil war. For the next 300 years, his descendants built the nation into the largest empire on earth. By 1914, the Russian Empire stretched across 11 time zones and held 170 million people. The Tsar commanded an army of millions. His family possessed wealth beyond imagination. The imperial treasury overflowed with Fabergé eggs, crowns studded with diamonds, and enough gold to fill warehouse after warehouse. Nicholas himself had come to the throne in 1894 after the sudden death of his father, Alexander III. He was 26 years old and utterly unprepared. His own father had told ministers that Nicholas was still a child who knew nothing of governing. The young Tsar agreed. He reportedly wept when told he would become emperor, asking his cousin what he was supposed to do when he knew nothing about ruling. He married Princess Alix of Hesse, a German granddaughter of Queen Victoria. She converted to Russian Orthodoxy and became Alexandra Fyodorovna. Within 11 years, she gave him 4 daughters. Olga came first in 1895, then Tatiana in 1897. Maria arrived in 1899, and Anastasia followed in 1901. Each birth brought disappointment to the empire. Russia needed a male heir. Only a son could inherit the throne. When Alexei finally arrived in 1904, the relief was overwhelming. But within weeks, the celebration turned to horror. The baby would not stop bleeding from his navel. Doctors diagnosed hemophilia, an incurable blood disorder inherited through Alexander's genes. The slightest bump could cause internal bleeding that might kill him. The family kept the illness secret from everyone except their closest servants. The secrecy bred isolation. Nicholas and Alexandra withdrew from court society. They lived simply by royal standards, sleeping on camp beds, taking cold baths, and raising their children without extravagance. The four Grand Duchesses shared 2 bedrooms. They called themselves OTMA, an acronym from their first initials, and were inseparable in the way only sisters who share a secret world can be. Olga was the intellectual, prone to depression but brilliant. Tatiana was tall and elegant, her mother's favorite. Maria was gentle and beautiful, known for her enormous blue eyes. Anastasia was the mischief maker, short and stocky, famous for her pranks and her refusal to sit still. While the imperial children played with their dogs and studied their lessons, their father's empire crumbled around them. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904 ended in humiliating defeat. Revolution erupted in 1905. Nicholas granted a constitution and a parliament, then systematically undermined both. Workers starved while the court danced at balls. Peasants dreamed of land while nobles discussed French philosophy. Hovering over everything was the shadow of Grigory Rasputin, the Siberian peasant mystic whom Alexandra believed could heal her son. Rasputin's influence at court scandalized the nation. He was crude, dirty, reportedly drunk and lecherous. Alexandra clung to him because he alone seemed able to stop Alexei's bleeding episodes. Nicholas tolerated Rasputin to keep his wife calm. By 1916, rumors circulated that Rasputin controlled the government, that the German-born empress was a spy, that the royal family had gone mad. In December 1916, a group of nobles murdered Rasputin. They poisoned him, shot him, and finally drowned him in the frozen Neva River. It made no difference. 2 months later, the February Revolution swept through Petrograd. Workers went on strike. Soldiers mutinied. The Duma demanded that Nicholas abdicate. On March 15, 1917, in a railway car at Pskov, the last Tsar of Russia signed away his throne. He also signed away his son's rights, naming his brother Michael as successor. But Michael refused the crown, and the dynasty that had ruled for 300 years simply ended. The family expected to go into exile. Nicholas wanted to live quietly in Crimea, tending his garden. The British government initially offered asylum, but King George V, Nicholas's first cousin, who looked so much like him they could have been twins, withdrew the invitation. George feared that sheltering the unpopular Tsar would spark revolution in Britain, so the Romanovs stayed in Russia, prisoners of the revolution they had failed to prevent. The Bolsheviks, who seized power in November 1917, understood the danger perfectly. The Romanovs were not just a family, they were a symbol. As long as any of them lived, they could become rallying points for counter-revolution. Through the spring and summer of 1918, the family was moved deeper into Russia, farther from any hope of rescue. They went first to Tobolsk in Siberia, where they lived in relative comfort. Then in April, Nicholas, Alexandra, and Maria were taken to Yekaterinburg, a Bolshevik stronghold in the Ural Mountains. The other children followed a month later, after Alexei recovered enough from a bleeding episode to travel. The train journey terrified the girls. Guards reportedly molested them along the way. Yekaterinburg was different from Tobolsk. The Ipatiev house had been renamed the House of Special Purpose. Workers built a high wooden fence around it. They whitewashed the windows so no one could see in or out. Guards watched the family constantly. The prisoners could use only one toilet, and guards followed them even there. Food was scarce and bad. The Grand Duchesses, once served by dozens of servants, now did their own laundry and helped the cook prepare meals. Outside the house, the Russian Civil War raged. White armies loyal to the old regime pushed toward Yekaterinburg. Czech soldiers fighting for the Allies approached from the east. Lenin and the Bolshevik leadership in Moscow faced a terrible choice. They could move the family again, risking their escape. They could put Nicholas on trial, risking that he might become a martyr. Or they could simply eliminate the problem entirely. The order came in mid-July. The local Bolsheviks decided to kill everyone, not just Nicholas, but his wife, all 5 children, and the 4 servants who had remained loyal to them. On the night of July 16th, the family ate dinner, said their prayers, and went to bed. They did not know that the kitchen boy who played with Alexei had been removed from the house to protect him from what was coming. After midnight, Yakov Yurovsky, the commandant, woke the family. He told them they were being moved because fighting had reached the city. They should dress and come downstairs. Nicholas carried Alexei in his arms. Alexandra asked for chairs because she and the boy were too weak to stand. 2 chairs were brought. The family arranged themselves as if posing for a photograph. Then the executioners entered. The killing was supposed to take seconds. Instead, it took 20 minutes. The basement filled with gun smoke so thick the killers could not see their victims. Bullets bounced off the girls' jewel-lined corsets. Alexei seemed to be wearing a vest made entirely of diamonds. The executioners had to finish the children with bayonets and rifle butts. Alexandra died trying to cross herself. Nicholas fell first and fastest, hit by multiple bullets before he could finish asking what was happening. By the end, blood covered the walls, the floor, and the killers themselves. The bodies were loaded onto a truck and driven into the forest. The executioners stripped them, burned what clothing survived, and threw the corpses down a mine shaft. But the shaft proved too shallow. They hauled the bodies out again, poured acid on the faces to prevent identification, and buried 9 of them in a pit under a railroad track. They burned 2 of the bodies, probably Alexei and 1 daughter, and buried those remains separately to confuse anyone who might find the main grave. But the murder in the basement was only the beginning. The Bolsheviks had other Romanovs to kill. Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich had actually been the first to die. Nicholas's younger brother, the man Nicholas had tried to make Tsar when he abdicated, was shot near Perm on June 13, 1918, more than a month before the massacre at Yekaterinburg. He had been living in relative freedom under Bolshevik surveillance, staying at a hotel with his British secretary, Nicholas Johnson. 5 armed men came for them after midnight. They were driven into the forest and told they were being transferred by train. When the carriages stopped, Michael was shot as he walked toward the supposed railroad crossing. The gun aimed at him misfired at first. He ran to his dying secretary with his arms outstretched, begging to say goodbye. The executioners fired again. It was approximately 2 o'clock in the morning. Michael was 39 and Johnson was 40. Neither body has ever been found. One day after the Yekaterinburg massacre, another group of Romanovs died at Alapayevsk, a mining town 60 miles away. Grand Duchess Elizabeth Fyodorovna led this group. She was Alexandra's older sister, a woman who had converted to Russian Orthodoxy after marrying into the Romanov family. Her husband, Grand Duke Sergei, had been assassinated by a revolutionary bomb in 1905. Elizabeth had personally gathered the scattered pieces of his body from the snow. Then she visited his assassin in prison and offered him forgiveness. After her husband's death, Elizabeth sold her jewels and founded a religious order in Moscow. She became an abbess, caring for the poor and sick. The revolution found her wearing a nun's habit instead of a crown. The Bolsheviks arrested her anyway. At Alapayevsk, Elizabeth was held with 5 other Romanovs. Grand Duke Sergei Mikhailovich was 59. Prince Ioan Konstantinovich was 32. Prince Konstantin Konstantinovich was 28. Prince Igor Konstantinovich was 24. And Prince Vladimir Paley was only 21. On July 18th, Bolshevik soldiers told the prisoners they were being moved for their safety. Instead, they were driven to an abandoned mine shaft. Sergei Mikhailovich resisted and was shot in the head. The others were hit with rifle butts and thrown alive into the 60-foot pit. When sounds continued to come from the shaft, the soldiers threw grenades down after them. The grenades did not silence the voices. For hours, perhaps days, some of the victims survived in the darkness. When White Army forces recovered the bodies months later, they found that Elizabeth had torn strips from her habit to bandage the prince's head wounds. Hymns could reportedly be heard rising from the shaft long after the soldiers had left. Elizabeth's body, unlike the others, did not decompose. Believers called it a miracle. Her remains were eventually transported through Siberia, across China, and finally to Jerusalem, where she rests today in the Church of Mary Magdalene on the Mount of Olives. The Russian Orthodox Church canonized her as a saint. The killing continued into 1919. On January 28th, 4 more Grand Dukes faced a firing squad in the courtyard of the Peter and Paul Fortress in Petrograd. Grand Duke Paul Alexandrovich was Nicholas's uncle, 58 years old and in failing health. Grand Duke Dmitry Konstantinovich, also 58, had spent years as a patron of the arts. Grand Duke Nikolai Mikhailovich, 59, was a renowned historian who had corresponded with Leo Tolstoy. Grand Duke George Mikhailovich, 55, had been an expert on coins and medals. All 4 were first cousins, their fathers all sons of Nicholas I. The men were marched to a ditch that had been dug in the fortress courtyard. A firing squad waited. Nikolai Mikhailovich reportedly asked to smoke a final cigarette. He was refused. The men removed their outer clothing, which would be seized by the state, and stood in the freezing January night. The bullets came moments later. Their bodies were thrown into a common grave. In all, 18 Romanovs were murdered during the Revolution. 14 died between June and July of 1918 alone. But for every Romanov who died, more than 2 escaped. Of the 65 members of the imperial family alive in 1917, 47 eventually reached safety abroad. Their escapes ranged from harrowing to almost leisurely. The most dramatic rescue came in April 1919, when HMS Marlborough arrived at Yalta to evacuate the Dowager Empress Maria Feodorovna. She was Nicholas's mother, 71 years old, and the sister of Britain's Queen Alexandra. King George V had finally sent a warship to save her after months of delay. Maria at first refused to leave. She still did not believe that her son and grandchildren were dead. The Soviet government had announced only Nicholas's execution, claiming the family had been sent somewhere safe. Maria clung to this hope for years. She finally agreed to go only after demanding that the ship also evacuate every Russian refugee who wanted to leave. The Marlborough departed with 17 Romanovs aboard, plus dozens of servants, nobles, and military officers. As the ship steamed out of the harbor on April 11th, another vessel passed, carrying Imperial Guard officers heading to fight the Bolsheviks. When the soldiers saw the tiny black-clad figure of the Dowager Empress standing on deck, they began singing the Russian imperial anthem. It was the last time Maria would hear it on Russian soil. Also aboard the Marlborough were Maria's daughter, Grand Duchess Xenia, and her sons, along with Prince Felix Yusupov and his wife, Princess Irina. Felix had led the conspiracy to murder Rasputin. Now he was fleeing with whatever jewels his family could smuggle past the Bolsheviks. The Yusupovs would later sell Rembrandt paintings and a famous diamond to survive in exile. Maria eventually settled in Denmark, her native country. She had been born Princess Dagmar in 1847. a Danish princess who became Empress of Russia through marriage. Now she returned as a refugee. She lived at Vidura Villa near Copenhagen, supported by a pension from King George V, who called her "My dear Aunt Minnie." She refused to sell the jewels she had brought from Russia, even when money grew tight, and she never accepted that Nicholas and his children were dead. When relatives visited, she would not allow anyone to speak of the executions. She died on October 13, 1928, still believing her son might somehow return. Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna, Nicholas's youngest sister, took a different path. She refused to board the Marlborough with her mother, choosing instead to stay in Russia with her second husband, a commoner named Nikolai Kulikovsky. As the Bolsheviks advanced, Olga and her family fled south. One of Maria Fyodorovna's personal bodyguards helped them escape through the countryside. Olga gave birth to her second child in a rented farmhouse while on the run. The family finally reached Denmark in April 1920 and reunited with the Dowager Empress. Olga lived modestly in exile. She had no interest in royal pretensions. She and her husband farmed in Denmark for years, and after World War II they immigrated to Canada. She worked as a painter, selling her artwork to support herself. She lived in a small house near Toronto and died in 1960, the last surviving child of Alexander III. Before her death, she met with a biographer and spoke candidly about the revolution, her family's failures, and the impostors who had plagued them for decades. The impostor phenomenon began almost immediately after the executions. Because the Bolsheviks initially lied about what happened, claiming the family had been moved to safety, rumors of survival spread wildly. Over the years, more than 100 people claimed to be members of the murdered imperial family. Most were quickly exposed as frauds. But one persisted for more than 60 years. Anna Anderson appeared in Berlin in 1920, pulled from a canal after a suicide attempt. She refused to identify herself at first, earning the name Fräulein Unbekannt, or Miss Unknown. Eventually, other patients at the mental hospital where she was held began claiming she was Grand Duchess Anastasia. Anderson neither confirmed nor denied the claims at first. Then she embraced the identity. For decades, Anna Anderson divided the Romanov family and fascinated the world. Some relatives who met her became convinced she was Anastasia. They pointed to physical similarities, her knowledge of court life, and scars that seemed to match the bayonet wounds the real Anastasia would have suffered. Other relatives declared her an obvious fraud. They noted that she refused to speak Russian, could not remember basic facts about the imperial household, and had physical features that did not match Anastasia's. In 1927, a private investigator identified Anderson as Franziska Szankowska, a Polish factory worker who had been injured in a munitions explosion and declared insane. Szankowska had disappeared from Berlin shortly before Anderson appeared. The identification was ignored by Anderson's supporters. Anderson fought legal battles for decades, seeking recognition as Anastasia and access to the Romanov fortune supposedly held in European banks. German courts ultimately ruled that she had neither proven nor disproven her identity. She married an American professor in 1968 and moved to Charlottesville, Virginia, where she lived in squalor with numerous dogs and cats. She died of pneumonia on February 12, 1984. The truth came from DNA. In 1991, the main grave outside Yekaterinburg was excavated. Scientists used bone samples to confirm the remains were those of Nicholas, Alexandra, and 3 of their daughters. In 1994, DNA testing proved definitively that Anna Anderson was not related to the Romanovs. Her mitochondrial DNA matched that of a great-nephew of Franziska Szankowska. She had been a mentally troubled Polish factory worker all along. In 2007, Archaeologists found the final two bodies in a separate grave nearby. DNA testing confirmed these were the remains of Alexei and one of his sisters, most likely Maria. The entire imperial family was now accounted for. Every child who died in that basement had been found. There were no survivors. There never had been. The Romanov remains were reinterred with state honors in 1998 at the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg, the traditional resting place of Russian czars. President Boris Yeltsin attended the ceremony and called the executions one of the most shameful pages in Russian history. In 2000, the Russian Orthodox Church canonized Nicholas, Alexandra, and their 5 children as passion bearers, recognizing their suffering and humility in the face of death. Today, about 30 descendants of the broader Romanov family are scattered across the world. Most descend from Nicholas II's cousins and aunts rather than from his immediate family, which was entirely wiped out. The question of who would be Tsar if Russia restored its monarchy remains disputed. Grand Duchess Maria Vladimirovna, born in 1953 and currently living in Spain, claims to be the rightful heir. She is a great-great-granddaughter of Alexander II and the daughter of Grand Duke Vladimir Kirillovich, who declared himself head of the imperial house in 1938. Her son, Grand Duke George Mikhailovich, is her designated heir. But many other Romanov descendants reject her claim, arguing that her family's marriages violated the strict succession laws established by Emperor Paul I. The disputes continue to this day, arguments over a throne that no longer exists. The murdered children never had a chance to dispute anything. Olga was 22 when she died. Tatiana was 21. Maria was 19. Anastasia was 17, having celebrated her birthday just a month before the execution. Alexei was 13, 2 weeks shy of his 14th birthday. They spent their final months doing laundry, baking bread, and trying to maintain hope in a house surrounded by hostile guards. They went to their deaths believing they were being moved to yet another prison. They never knew that their father's cousin had abandoned them, that rescue attempts had failed, that the world outside had largely forgotten them. The basement of the Ipatiev house was demolished in 1977 on orders from the local Communist Party chief, a man named Boris Yeltsin, who would later, as president of Russia, oversee the reburial of the people whose death site he had destroyed. A church now stands where the house once stood, the Church on Blood in honor of all saints, resplendent in the Russian land, draws pilgrims from around the world. They light candles for the family that died there. They pray for the souls of children who never grew old. The Romanovs ruled for 304 years. They built St. Petersburg, defeated Napoleon, and expanded their empire across a continent. They also oppressed millions, crushed dissent, and clung to autocratic power long after other monarchies had reformed. Nicholas II was not a monster, but he was not a good Tsar either. He loved his family more than his country, and trusted his wife's judgment over his ministers. He could have saved himself and his children if he had abdicated sooner, accepted exile earlier, or simply been less stubborn. Instead, he led them all to that basement. The sins of the father passed to the children, who had done nothing wrong except be born into the wrong family at the wrong time. Anastasia's pranks could not save her. Alexei's bravery in the face of constant pain could not protect him. The Grand Duchess's diamonds sewn into their clothes as insurance for exile only prolonged their suffering as bullets ricocheted off their bodies. In the end, they died not for anything they had done, but for what they represented. They were symbols, and symbols had to be destroyed. And they are not the only dynasty that was torn from its throne and scattered into exile. The Habsburgs ruled Austria-Hungary for 600 years until their empire collapsed overnight, leaving 8 children to grow up in poverty across 3 continents. If you want to see what happened to them, watch What Happened to the Habsburg Family After Franz Joseph Died.